Hi everyone. So today we have another supplemental video particularly for people that are thinking of being music majors or music minors. So we have a system that relates to inversions that we call figured bass, something that you see a lot in undergrad music theory like pedagogy programs. So you may be wondering, what the heck is figured bass? Well, figured bass is a common way that music majors are taught to identify inversion. That's just called figured bass. So, figured bass symbols, which in this case are just numbers, actually predate how we think about chords or triads, and in essence, they come from thinking of music in terms of intervals. So, we now know that a major chord, for instance, is a major third and a perfect fifth, thirds and fifths, thirds and fifths. But if you flip what's on the bottom, you would get different intervals if those notes were compacted. For instance, if you were to put the third of the chord in the bottom, well, now you'd have, from your bottom note, a sixth above and a third above. So that was we didn't really know what chords were. We just thought of things in terms of intervals. So because of that, the figured bass are kind of a substitution for thinking about the way that we do in the modern sense of chords. It's particularly used by accompanists in the Baroque period from around 1600 to 1750 to flesh out bass lines with intervals above. So they may have a piece of music where they have a bass line and there would be numbers underneath, and those numbers would correspond to intervals above. The performer would then flesh out those intervals, and that would give us essentially what would later be described as chord progressions. So figured bass comes from that. So why do we use it? And why don't we use it? Why are we doing this as a supplemental and not as part of the main class? Well, figured bass symbols in the modern sense are used alongside Roman numerals to show what inversions chords are in. So instead of a slash to show what notes on the bottom, we can use figured bass. So what we're doing in class is not necessarily exactly the way that music majors do it, because figured bass is kind of something that's really still very much in the classical tradition that a lot of our undergraduate courses are kind of built around. So why we don't really use it and why we haven't talked about it is exactly because of that. So figured bass was a useful way of thinking about chords, but it comes from a period where we didn't have tools like Roman numerals or lead sheet symbols. So the Roman numeral system is also younger than figured bass symbols are. So using figured bass to analyze music came about later. So it would be a tool of performance. It wasn't until the 19th century that analysts would go back and write in the figured bass symbols as an analytical tool. So it's kind of an anachronistic system. So, however, music majors are still expected to be familiar with these systems. So here we are. That's why we're here, because a lot of people still use them, and it's still seen as a required and important aspect of what we learn in our theory instruction. So let's look at some examples. So here we have triads. So figured bass for the triads are as follows. So root position, you have nothing. You just have a floating Roman numeral. Nothing is needed. It's root position. So as you can see here, we've got 1, 3, 5, root position, all good to go. So first inversion is either 6, 3 or a floating 6. So note that if we put G, if we flip the bottom note to the top, we now have a third from the bottom note and a sixth from the bottom note. So everything was measured from the bottom because we're still thinking in terms of intervals. This is such a common inversion that the 3 is often dropped. You might just see floating 6s. That's because it's so common. First inversion chords are so common that it's kind of a conventional thing. Second inversion, 6-4. Notice that if we now move B up an octave, we get a fourth here and then a sixth here. Notice that our numbers, when we read them left to right, sounds like they're top down, but as you can see, when they're written out like this, they're written out bottom up. So from the bottom is a third, from the bottom is a sixth, not from the bottom is a sixth and the bottom is a third. So you kind of imagine the bass note down here and then go up from there. So since figured bass are named from intervals, all of our numbers based on whatever note is on the bottom. So for instance, because B is on the bottom, that's why it's a 6-3. It's a G chord, and we can have the Roman numeral to clarify that it's a G chord. It's a 1 in first inversion, a 1-6 chord, but it is still based on the intervals from the bottom note. So if we take a root position triad and invert it, the figured bass symbols come from the new intervals. So this is basically the system that you'd have. And then once we get back up here, we're at the octave again. So this covers what we've talked about this week already. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and proceed now to kind of some new territory that we actually don't, at this point, have all the capacity to talk about yet. which is what's called seventh chords. So we haven't talked about seventh chords yet, so feel free to pause the video right here and just come back to it when we get to seventh chords. But seventh chords also have their own unique figured bass, because since we have different notes, we've got different intervals. Here's your seventh chord inversions. Root position, a floating 7. We will see that as we proceed into next week. A floating 7, that represents that there is a 7th in the chord, a 4th note to a chord. First inversion, we use a floating 6-5. You may be wondering, why is it not 6-5-3? Well, for the ease of use, for instance. We still can use 2 numbers to get the job done, so we do. We don't need 6-5-3. We don't need, it's not necessary. Second inversion, we use 4-3. And finally, for third inversion, we use 4-2. Now, some of this is just often just memorized. If you're in root position, it's 7. If you're in first inversion, if the third is in the bass, it's 6-5, and so on and so on. Where the names come from is from this cluster right here. So notice that when we flip up G up an octave, we now have a G and an F kind of cluster. G and F are really close together. That means that we have 6-5, that's what it's named for. 4-3, that's what it's named for. So if you need to kind of remember visually what to look for, that's where it comes from. And then 4-2, of course, that's just in your bottom there. So 4-2 being, of course, from D down to B, with 2 being the 1 there. So if you need to remember what your 7th chords are for figured bass, you can think of it kind of like a countdown. So like 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, another 4, 2. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 4, 2, and so on. So it's kind of like a countdown. Root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. And then if you go back up again, you get root position again. So that's kind of where these come from. So these are just the figured bass symbols. Here's some other considerations. For minor keys, where we've raised pitches, like scale degree 7 in harmonic minor, for instance, which we done from the last supplemental video, we can include a sharp next to the figured bass to show this. Something else we sometimes see is a floating sharp or a natural, which indicates that we have a root position chord that is a raised third. For instance, something like this. This happens in minor scales where we have the tonic, major, triad. So say this is the end of a piece in G minor, but we want to end on G major to end happily. Fun fact, this is actually has a name. It's called a Picardy third, when we end on a major chord, a major tonic chord in a minor key. Notice here that we just have a floating accidental there, a floating natural sign. That shows us that we have a root position chord where the third has been raised, and so on. So, we can show other things like suspensions, cadential 6/4 cadences, things that we're not going to talk about in this class that if you're a music major, you will eventually talk about in the 5 series. So notice that we have here, we've got a 6 chord. We've seen that before. It's E flat major. It's in root position. So we could just have a floating 6. That gets the job done. Over here, we could have a floating 5. Gets the job done for this. We've got what's called a suspension here, a cadential 6/5 cadence. 6/4 cadence. We don't know what that is yet. That's fine. And then a floating 7 to show that we are adding a 7th here. And so on. So, again, you might not understand 100% what's happening in all of this yet, and that's totally fine. This is just kind of to preface you for things to come if you're going on to more theory classes after Music 11. So let's listen to this brief little passage here. And so on. We started in major, we ended minor. So let's look at an example in context. So this is going to have 7th chords, and root position chords, just as a heads up. Figured bass symbols in the modern sense are used alongside Roman numerals to show what inversions chords are in. So this example has both 7 chords and triads. So try to identify the Roman numerals and then look for what inversion they're in. So instead of me just waiting and giving you time, go ahead and pause the video right now. I'll give you a couple seconds to buffer. Pause the video right now and try this out. Look at what's in the bottom. Look at the notes that you have. Try to relate them back to your triads. This is a Bach chorale. This is a common thing that we have as tools of study. And as we go through the quarter, again, this might not be ready. You might not be ready for this yet. Feel free to revisit this to practice this out. So, hopefully you've paused. Hopefully I stalled for enough time. Oh, whoops. Provide the appropriate figured bass symbols. Well, that goes without saying because we're doing figured bass. So, here's what that looks like. If we're in the key of C major, we've got 4, a 4 chord in first inversion. It's an F chord. Notice we've got F, A, C, and A's in the bass. We go to a 5 chord, but it's a 7th chord. Tricky, tricky. That's why it's a 6/5. with the third of that chord in the bass. We go to 1 in root position, C, G, E. We can ignore that note. We go to a 2 chord, but it's also a 7th chord. That's why it's got a 6-5. It's a 2 chord with the 7th, and the third of that chord is in the bass. So that would be F in the bass, as you can see. You've got D, F, A, C, a 5 chord in root position, a 1 chord in root position. And that sounds like this. And so on. So there you go. Just a very, very brief little passage. You can kind of see the origins of this. It's designed for music that looks like this. In a modern sense, we use figured bass less and less to describe things like this, but it is still useful to know if you're looking at a particular style of music, or if you're a music major, you just need that as kind of your basic competencies. So that is figured bass. Let me know if you have any questions. Revisit this video as necessary in the future. And yeah, that's a real quick, real brief primer for figured bass as an addition to our inversion identification systems.